From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Biden administration mandates a massive increase in electric trucks over the next 8 years, as new IRS data shows that the top 1% of taxpayers paid 46% of America's income taxes in 2021. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. The Environmental Protection Agency on Friday rolled out a set of regulations on pollution from trucks and other heavy vehicles, a rule that the EPA thinks means that a quarter of long-haul trucks could be zero emissions vehicles by the year 2032. That is a target that the American Trucking Associations says is, quote, unachievable, unquote. Let's listen to the ATA chairman, Andrew Boyle, testifying before Congress about electric trucks last year.
While we share the passion for EVs and cars and light-duty vehicles, projecting an automotive construct onto trucking industry dynamics is a massive mistake. And let me be clear, if battery electric trucks had adequate range, there was adequate charging infrastructure, and utilities could deliver the power, we truckers would be delighted. But let me explain our reality. Today, a clean diesel truck can spend 15 minutes fueling anywhere in the country and then have a range of about 1,200 miles before fueling again. In contrast, today's long-haul battery electric trucks have a range of about 150 to maybe 330 miles and can take up to 10 hours to charge. So for the same 1,200-mile journey, we'd go from 15 minutes of fueling a clean diesel truck once to charging today's BEV 4 to 8 times for dozens and dozens of hours. And this is assuming there are chargers where you need them. We would need far more trucks to haul the same amount of freight, and each of those trucks would cost 2 to 3 times a comparable diesel truck. Converting the U.S. fleet of Class 8 trucks to battery electric would require a $1 trillion investment, which ultimately would flow to consumers.
Alicia, can you give us more details on what this EPA rule sets out to do, how it intends to do it, and whether this is really as unachievable as the critics are saying?
My first thought when I looked at this rule, when it came out on Friday, is that this is just insane. And I think that that's the top line, what the EPA is requiring truck manufacturers to do. And there are 6 or 7 major truck manufacturers. It is very similar to what it's requiring the automakers to do for passenger cars. And that's basically de facto increase their production of battery-powered electric trucks over time from the period 2027 to 2032. And it does this through setting stringent greenhouse gas emissions requirements that the truck manufacturers can't achieve by any other means. And so by 2032, it classifies different kinds of trucks. And there's like 4 or 5, like light duty vocational, medium duty vocational, heavy duty or long haul, various different kinds of truck makes. But for instance, the urban delivery trucks that you see, going around the suburbs, the UPS trucks and Amazon trucks, about 60% of those would have to be EVs by 2032, and 25% of the long-haul tractors, and those are the ones that go cross-country, would have to be about 25%. Now, it's in between those, slightly shorter haul, drayage trucks, that's around 40%. Ambitious is probably an understatement here, considering that EVs make up less than 1% of U.S. heavy-duty truck sales. And to just put that in perspective, at least in the automotive, the passenger vehicle sector, the EVs make up about 8% of the sales. For these trucks, semis, they're really, for the most part, don't exist. There are very few sales. There have been maybe a few hundred in California over time. And California is actually mandating that truckers buy them because, well, they really have no reason to. You heard some of the problems with this mandate, including that the battery-powered EV trucks cost 2 to 3 times more. And we're talking about 2 to 3, so that's probably $200,000 to $300,000 more than a regular diesel-powered truck. And that's an even bigger differential than the differential between an electric passenger car like a Tesla and a gas-powered one. The other big issue is the charging, right? And these electric trucks suck up a ton of power just on a single charge. They can consume 7 times more than a home does in a day. And the requirement is that you need to have a lot of chargers, and then you need to have the grid infrastructure set up, which means you have to basically really strengthen the grid in certain areas where there are going to be truck charging depots. And to get all that infrastructure, that could take potentially 8 years, especially if it's in a kind of more remote rural area where you have to expand the grid. And on top of that, as he was mentioning, is that they're going to have to be waiting for 6 or 7 hours to charge. Most of this is probably going to occur at night, but for the shorter haul ones, that's going to have to occur during the day. And by the way, most truckers are independent contractors. They kind of run their own business. These aren't big corporate entities. That's going to be time that they have to stop out of their day to refuel, which is, again, reduces efficiency, increases the cost, and consumers are going to end up paying.
To underline a couple of those numbers that Alicia said, so EV trucks right now are less than 1% of U.S. sales. And we're talking about a mandate that I get sounds far away. If a week is a long time in politics, as the saying goes, then 2032 is an eternity. But in the real world, that is not very long at all, Kim. And we're talking about requiring these truck manufacturers to have a quarter of their long haul sales, or more like 50 or 60% of their short haul trucks be electric vehicles in 8 years. That is a wild mandate to put on these manufacturers. And it's true that President Biden is also putting similar mandates on the car manufacturers. But one difference is that the challenge, the technological challenge simply in trucks is greater because A, they're going long distances, they're pulling big loads, and B, the point is to have them in use as much as possible. It's not like a car. Many people have Teslas and they love driving their Teslas, but most often their Tesla is sitting at home in their garage where it can be hooked up to a charger. And that is not the kind of use case that we're talking about when we're talking about delivery trucks or long haul big rigs.
Yeah, correct. Trucks are about return on investment. And in some ways, as absolutely fanciful and silly as this rule is, it's useful in clarifying that technological problem that you note, which is present, by the way, in all electric vehicles. But suddenly when you're talking about these 18-wheelers that need to do long distances and go long hours of the day and that weigh a lot, it really puts it into focus, the physics problem. And just, I have a couple of numbers that I think would help clarify this for people. If you are looking at a semi-truck, just not even hooked up to a trailer, it weighs on average about 35,000 pounds. But when you have a trailer behind it, what creates essentially an 18-wheeler, they can haul loads of up to 80,000 pounds. Compare that to the 3,000 pounds of a passenger vehicle. Now, we already have Americans that are concerned and have been reluctant to buy EVs because of worries about their range and how long it takes to charge them, et cetera. Now, consider this for one of these 18-wheelers. A diesel-fired truck can fill up with diesel fuel in about 15 minutes and drive 1,000 miles before it has to do anything again. What we're finding with the very few electric vehicles for trucks that are out there is they can make it on average about 170 miles a charge before they need to fill up again. And then that takes on average a charge about 90 minutes. And that's if you're using a really good EV charger, one that essentially a facility is set up to deal with the amount of juice that these giant vehicles need, which are an issue all on their own. Companies that have been experimenting with this in California have spent billions of dollars trying to upgrade their infrastructure just to manage the small fleets of trucks that they have. What this means is that if you're a driver, normally you could drive 400 or 500 miles per shift, maybe up to 600. They're going to be able to operate at about a third of that capacity. And you've got to think about the loss of efficiency, the loss of wages. A lot of drivers, while they get paid per hour, they actually get a commission for the number of loads that they do. This is just a ridiculous idea that you can do this, especially in the space of time that they are putting out there. And I think some of those math numbers just clarify that case.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. To pick up where Kim left off, one of the lessons of economics, one reason they call it the dismal science perhaps, is because it teaches that somebody always pays. And that's the other thing, Alicia, that strikes me of these kinds of mandates from politicians is they end up creating all sorts of winners and losers and cross subsidies and things that are difficult to tease out, but that are buried inside these industries. And Kim was touching on some of this, but we had a writer who wrote along recently with an electric truck driver in California. And I would commend that story to people. The headline is Electric Mandates Have California Truckers Charging Overtime. And the way that the ride went, the electric truck did 2 hauls in a day, and in a diesel truck, the driver said that he could have done 6. And one of the losers was the driver because he's paid hourly, but he also gets a commission per delivery. And so the driver said that he was earning $400 less per month. And then there's also a cost on consumers because the operator of the truck figured out that it had a $310 loss from operating the EV truck instead of the diesel truck. And so then there's a surcharge tacked on for the deliveries. And so that filters down through the economy to consumers. And Alicia, I think that those kinds of effects are often lost on politicians who just see the bill saying, we're going to create some electric trucks and don't really think about or grapple with the fact that it's going to put an awful lot of hidden costs on an awful lot of people.
Well, right. The funny thing is that the administration actually claims that this is going to be a jobs creator because all of a sudden they're forcing this transition. They're forcing the truck manufacturers to create a new product in increasing numbers, and that's just going to create all the jobs, which is just fanciful economics. China's done this, and you can see that it has one of the nation's highest youth unemployment rates. But that aside, we've spoken about the cost to the truckers of just the operational cost, but there's also other costs. There's the cost of upgrading the grid, which is estimated to be about $370 billion, just to make it feasible to the extent that it can be. And who's going to pay for that? The people who are going to pay for that are ratepayers, and you're going to see the cost in your electric bills. And that's partly why Californians pay the highest rates in the country, is because there's a lot of money that's having to go into hardening the grid to facilitate this EV transition. I think the projection is around $620 billion that the truck operators are going to have to pay to install all these chargers across the country, usually at their own depots. Who's going to pay for that? It's their own customers, and that could be manufacturers, retailers, but eventually all the freight costs will eventually get passed down to American consumers, whether they're paying more for food, it could be that they're paying more for goods. And then one other cost I would point out is just the cost, as we are discussing, to workers and the economy, this dead weight loss. You've already seen in California, which has the highest unemployment rate in the country, and it's actually been losing jobs, this area of warehouse and transportation. And some of that's just the slowdown in the goods sector of the economy as more people spend more on services. But some of it is the unintended consequences of a lot of its regulation. And you're probably going to have, in terms of California's mandates, which are more stringent than the U.S. overall, what you actually started seeing when those took effect is that truckers started moving out of the state or reducing their footprint so they wouldn't be bound by this. Now, the Biden administration's rule is going to make it even harder for them to kind of do this kind of a geographic arbitrage, because when truck manufacturers are having to produce these, they're going to just have fewer choices. And that's ultimately the way that they're going to mandate the truck operators buy these cars, is they just won't have any other choice. That's all that's going to be available. And it's very similar to the mandate for passenger cars in that sense.
Let's turn to some recently released data from the Internal Revenue Service showing where income tax money flowing into the U.S. Treasury comes from. And the top 1%, its share of adjusted gross income reported to the IRS in 2021 was about 25% of the nation's total, and it paid about 46% of income taxes overall. The group that is slightly below that on the income scale, that is below the top 1%, but above the top 5%, that group's share of national income was about 16%, and it paid about 20% of the total income taxes. Kim, there are obviously many ways to slice these kinds of data. One caution here is that this does not include the payroll tax, and the payroll tax is less of a progressive tax, as they say. On the other hand, this data also does not include the refundable portions of tax credits. So there are all sorts of people who end up effectively with negative income tax rates. And in the data, that is shown as spending from the government. So that does not show up in this IRS revenue data. But I think it is interesting in that this is not the story that you are getting from politicians and from Washington. It's constantly that the rich need to pay their fair share. And it turns out that the revenue coming into the IRS, nearly half of it is from the top 1% on the income tax. And so my question then is, what do you mean by fair share, and what would be enough?
I mean, you are right that these numbers never give a complete picture. But a couple of interesting points, though, when you do try to factor in some of those pictures, because those additional data, if you do some estimates, because it actually makes the situation even more striking. There was one analysis suggesting that in 2020, which was the year, obviously, that a lot of those COVID tax credits and tax breaks went out, many of which were refundable, that the bottom 60% of taxpayers actually had negative tax rates because of that, quote, spending that was headed into their household. It's also, I would just note, by the way, doesn't include all of the things that people who do pay taxes tend to pay, which would not just be for those that are on the wealthier end. They also pay payroll taxes up to a certain amount, but there's a Medicare surtax, there are state taxes, there are capital gains taxes. And so those push the numbers for the wealthy up even higher. In a lot of places, especially if you live in a high income tax state, like New York or California, you are easily paying more than, you're paying 50% tax rates. I think the bottom line here is that the top 10%, when you look at this data, paid almost 76% of all of the income taxes, which is just remarkable. And to your point, Kyle, is so completely at odds and shows the degree to which when Democrats stand up and say that the wealthy need to pay their fair share, I mean, what number exactly are they expecting them to pay? All of it? Because at a certain point, too, we know as well that when you see people hitting rates that high, when they are handing over routinely a quarter or more of their income, a lot of people begin to start thinking about ways to shelter their income, or they don't have the same incentive to take those risks or do that work, because it does feel, understandably, that a vast amount of the additional effort that people put into earning money isn't actually flowing into their own pocket. It's flowing into the federal government's, especially given the way marginal tax rates are set up and the fact that it's each additional dollar of income that gets penalized at a higher amount.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break.